Good afternoon, everyone. My name is William Beer, and I'm a member of the Information Security Forum USA's planning team. Absolutely thrilled to be here today to present the second in a series of 5 webinars looking at cyber resiliency in a defining moment in history. Today's session is specifically focusing on communicating in a crisis, and I'll be joined by my co-host, David Raviv, who you may remember from the previous session, and also Siobhan Gorman, who's a communications expert and a partner at Brunswick Group. But before we go any further, I do want to point out that these sessions are meant to be as interactive as possible. So please send us your comments and questions as we go through the session, and we'll do our very best to take them into account and explore them with our speaker. So today's session is going to focus on the importance of communicating in a crisis and look at how some of the recent developments, including COVID, are impacting communication experts and how they are dealing with the crisis. We'll also look at how to protect your reputation during a cyber crisis, and Siobhan will provide us with concrete examples based on real-life experience of do's and don'ts during a cyber crisis and how that can impact a company's reputation. I do want to also point out that we're very grateful for the sponsorship from Beyond Trust and Recorded Future. But at this point in time, maybe I'll hand off to David, who will get things going for today. David, over to you.
Thanks, William. Much appreciated. I appreciate getting the opportunity to be part of the ISF planning team here. I would love to introduce Siobhan Gorman, the partner of the Brunswick Group, to discuss a few questions around reputational risk. Siobhan, how are you this afternoon?
Great to be with you. Thanks so much for having me.
So Siobhan, talking about reputational risk, how do you quantify the impact in terms of dollar and cents? It seems like almost impossible at the time of the impact itself to do so.
Well, quantifying reputational risk is really hard because these kinds of, the impact on your reputation really happens over a longer period of time. Sometimes people will look at the decline or the effect on the stock price. In our experience, yeah, you can look at that, but over time, a stock price will tend to recover. I think that the reputation really tends to have its impact more broadly on the leadership of a company. And I think that you can probably ask that to either the former CEO or the former CISO of Equifax, for example. People tend to lose their jobs when things go badly and when it's seen broadly and very publicly that the company is not handling the crisis well.
Are the cyber events different from, kind of your run-of-the-mill corporate crisis?
Yes, I'm not sure that there's a run-of-the-mill corporate crisis, but cyber crises are quite different, and it's really important for companies to make sure that their executives are prepared for the fact that they are quite possibly going to have to acknowledge publicly, or at least to sort of key stakeholders, say customers, that there has been an incident well before they really know what happened. And so communicating about something when you have very few facts at hand is really challenging. There is a very human tendency to want to rule things out or say things that are very reassuring. This wasn't affected, or that system wasn't affected. And that can be very dangerous. In our experience, the first piece of information that you have about the nature of an incident often prove to evolve, or sometimes they can be completely different within a matter of hours or days or weeks. And so you really want to be careful in a cyber crisis not to get ahead of yourself, which is definitely something that there's a real human tendency to want to do.
You're absolutely correct. And, during this series, we talked about the importance of resiliency planning. How well do you think the industry is currently prepared, and how, especially when it comes to the communication in the crisis?
When you're saying industry, do you just mean the private sector more broadly?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I mean, there are different industries that are better and less well prepared. There are some industries that have really kind of been at the forefront broadly of cybersecurity preparedness, and I would put communications sort of as part of that. Financial services companies and others that have really sort of set the standard when it comes to cyber crisis preparation writ large. Have also kind of thought through the communications piece. But I would say that companies often don't think about the communications element when they're preparing, and oftentimes they're thinking about it for the first time when they're having an incident. And in our experience, when you're responding to an incident, how you respond is at this point equally important to the event itself, and sometimes can be more important because there are so many cyber events these days, and an increasing number sort of in this current work from home era. People understand that cyber crises are going to happen. But because of that, they also then expect companies to be prepared to respond in a way that is confidence building. And companies that haven't thought in advance about how they're going to communicate in a cyber crisis have a much harder time demonstrating confidence and competence in the moment because they haven't thought about it ahead of time.
And do you think that the general public and potentially the press have become numb in recent years due to the fact that there are so many events, so many breach announcements in the news?
Well, my background is as a reporter. I was a reporter for 17 years, and I covered cybersecurity as part of sort of an intelligence and national security beat. So I was one of those reporters, back in the day, sort of circa 2006 to maybe 2015 or so, who followed these types of things. And I will say that even over that period, you probably did start to see a little bit of breach fatigue, if you will. But the press is always keying in on new trends, and so anytime there is a shift in the threat, either the actors or the techniques or the types of companies being affected, there's going to be media interest. And so I think that given that we've now seen this shift to work from home in kind of the COVID era, if you will, and there's been a fair amount of coverage, particularly of state-based threats from Russia or wherever. I think that there is heightened interest now in the media, but that doesn't mean that every breach is going to be interesting. What it does mean is if you mess it up, you have a higher likelihood of having folks take note now than maybe they would have 6 months ago.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And things changed for you personally and professionally over the past several months, since the
Well, I won't
COVID-19
bore
hit?
you with the personal stuff, but in terms of professionally, I mean, it was interesting because at least our firm went to working remotely in mid-March, and even at that time there were a lot of people, and us included, sort of warning people and encouraging them to make sure that they were as buttoned up as they possibly could be from a cyber standpoint, because that was going to be a time of heightened risk as people moved to work from home. And then it was very quiet, and I was a little bit surprised. Typically we will at least have, one breach a month that comes in that we're helping companies respond to. We also do a lot of work when it comes to helping companies prepare for these types of events, as well as, positioning on cybersecurity issues. So, it's not a big deal really if we're not doing as many breach responses, but I thought that was a little curious. And then all of a sudden, sometime in May, it was like a switch flip. And we were getting like one a week. And for the past 6 weeks, definitely, we've had at least one a week, if not more, and it's almost on a rolling basis. And that's a very small sample size, just the piece that we happen to be working on. And the kinds of events that we work on are ones where the company obviously feels that there may be a more public component to it, or a component where they really have to communicate with a broader set of stakeholders, could be regulators or customers or what have you. So that's just a very small sample size. But I've talked with colleagues of mine who do cyber forensics, and they saw a similar uptick roughly around the same time. So I think there was kind of a lag. and now you've seen a pretty significant increase when it comes to breaches, and particularly around ransomware. I think almost every breach that we have responded to in the COVID era, not every single one, but probably 90% of them, have been ransom attacks. And we have seen the hackers, sort of these hacker groups that specialize in ransomware, really sort of upping the pressure and kind of doing their own PR, if you will, which is always a little more challenging, certainly for companies to manage, because you're in sort of a public debate almost with a hacker, with a criminal.
Siobhan, a couple of questions that have just come in from our viewers today. The first one, which I think is really interesting, is there's a lot of negativity surrounding cyber breaches. Can they be turned into a positive from a communication perspective if and when an organization desires to do so? So can there be a silver lining in the cloud?
Yes. I mean, I don't think there's ever a good breach, but there can be a well-handled breach, and there can be a breach where you emerge from it with your reputation in a better place. And usually you would do that by handling it really well, and particularly handling it in a way that is consistent both with your corporate values and consistent with what sort of your key stakeholders, who will probably often be customers, would expect. In fact, I wrote about this in Brunswick has a publication called the Brunswick Review, and we worked with Under Armour when they had to announce the breach of the MyFitnessPal app, which was 150 million people, and we wrote about that in the Brunswick Review because it was a really interesting case study in how a company actually gets credit for transparency and speed. And so if people understand that you are making a really strong effort to give them the information they need to better protect themselves and their data, you'll get credit for that.
Interesting, and very interesting. The other question, which I wanted to touch on, is do you think that your job has become more complex during COVID-19? So your ability to deliver services and provide support to your clients while working from home, while working 100% remotely, is that impacting timelines and impacting the effectiveness of you and your team?
That's a really good question. I think it's affected crisis response broadly. And in fact, we've actually been talking with a number of companies about the importance of doing cyber crisis and even sort of more broadly crisis simulations in this era, so that people can get used to what it's like to be working together as a crisis response team where everybody is on, Zoom, or pick your favorite platform, Microsoft Teams, it doesn't matter. But the whole point is there's no SOC, there's no war room, it's all virtual. And so getting used to managing that way and managing across different time zones and all that kind of stuff is really important. For me personally, the impact has actually been fairly limited. I mean, you also work in the consulting arena, William, and we're sort of not even trained, if you will, but just sort of set up to be able to do our work from basically anywhere. So, I mean, I've helped clients with breaches from hotel rooms. I've helped clients with breaches from, sidewalk, street corners. It's you kind of do it as you need to, and you're built to be flexible. So I don't know that it's affected the way that we're doing our work so much as the fact that we need to make sure that we bring our clients along with us, and that companies understand that they may be used to working more in person, and that may not be an option. We did work with one company where actually our client admitted to me later that they all just had to go into the office because they had to manage it together, and they realized that it was like a little bit risky, but like that was their risk calculus. So, in some cases you may be able to do that, but in most cases you're going to be almost like in this type of format.
Understood. Thank you. David, back to you.
Yeah, so Siobhan, I would love to dive a little deeper into the kind of the do's and don'ts during the crisis, and maybe kind of pick up the where we left off. Can you share with us a real bad day, what a real bad day looks like when you are dealing with a cyber crisis, and what lessons did you specifically learn from this event?
A really bad day for me, or a really bad day for the company?
For the company,
Okay.
obviously.
I think that the toughest days are the ones where companies are dealing with a lot of uncertainty. Lately, that has been related to ransomware, and what these hackers will do these days is they'll be reaching out to you, and there's sort of the decision around, do you engage? Do you have a policy around payment or not payment of ransom? If you don't engage, then is the clock ticking, and you need to figure out what things you need to get in place, because either your systems are going to be down until you can restore from backup. Or maybe they've also stolen data, and you've got to prepare for the fact that that data may be made public. And so I think that the really bad days these days for companies are when they're dealing with so many of these moving parts and so much uncertainty around what some other actor is going to do, as that actor tries to gain leverage over your company, right? Everything they do is trying to gain leverage. And so, if they just announce on a website that they have gotten into your systems and they have, a bazillion terabytes of data or whatever it is, they do that purposefully so that you'll say, okay, we'll pay. We don't want that out there. But then you're already dealing with the fact that there's a hacker who's announced that they've gotten into your system. And so, you're still dealing with the reputational issues that presents, while also trying to figure out, well, how is it that we're going to manage this whole situation? And even for companies that do decide to pay, there's considerations around insurance. There's considerations just around the kind of the physical ability to get Bitcoin. And dealing with regulators sometimes around the question about paying, not paying, or notification. And so I think that the challenges that companies face right now is just that there are so many different decisions that they need to make seemingly all at once. And the key is really just to prioritize and kind of go straight down the line and try to be as efficient as possible in your decision making, because you can't do everything simultaneously, but you do need to do it all fairly quickly. And that's really where preparation comes into play, because the more of these things that you can kind of think through in advance, the more scenario planning you can do, the more you can do to make sure that you have your processes in place for decision making, the faster you're going to be able to make those decisions.
So definitely, so out of these, all these challenges you just mentioned, in your opinion, what do you find like the toughest aspect of dealing with the cyber crisis?
I think it's the time lag, in terms of, that something's gone wrong, and yet it takes a while to get the forensics experts in. It takes a much longer time than anyone would want for them to figure out what all has happened. And a lot of times it's going to happen in stages. You can start to figure out, okay, well, this is what's happened in this incident, but then you still need to do a broader scan of your systems to figure out if there's something else that's gone on. And a lot of times, when you discover that there's been one incident, you may well discover that there have been others as well. And so kind of making sure that you are able to be agile in your response, and yet also operate in a pretty limited information environment for a fairly extended time. I mean, it could be days or weeks. And that limited information is on a couple different fronts. It's around what happened, but if your systems are frozen up, it's also around operationally, when can you get back up and running? And everybody is going to be asking that question. And then if there is sort of a ransom element to the whole thing, how you deal with that bad actor, and that set of decisions is sort of a third track. And so that's that's really hard.
So from your extensive experience, what are your top do's and don'ts for CISOs?
For CISOs, I think, in terms of do's, absolutely, you want your plan, you want to be practicing your plan, and you want to make sure that both your plan and your practicing extend across the business, that it doesn't focus so much just on the technical piece that you don't think about the broader business decisions that are going to have to be made. And I think that we've definitely seen an elevation of the role of the CISO within the business over the last few years, and making sure that that's embedded in the business decision-making process is really important. In terms of don'ts, one thing that we commonly see is if the cybersecurity team is the one that's putting together the response plan, oftentimes they're at the center of the response. And while correctly they should be at the center of the technical response, oftentimes companies will have a pretty well-oiled crisis response or emergency response function. And generally, in any sort of crisis response, and this certainly applies in the cyber context, you want to use the processes that the business is already used to. You may have to make some adjustments along the way to account for some of the differences of a cyber crisis. But if you already have a pretty strong crisis response process, use it. And it doesn't actually make sense for the technical people to run kind of the business crisis response because they already have their day job in trying to figure out what happened, how to stop it, and all of that. So those are at least some of the do's and don'ts.
Yeah, that's very enlightening. So looking back at the ISF CISO briefing documents and the things that you believe a firm should be doing from a communication perspective now as they adapt, what can be done to help enterprise resume when things start to get back to normal?
So I think it's, usually when we look at crisis response, there's sort of the before, the preparation piece, the during, sort of the response piece, and then the after, which is the recovery. And while it's very hard to plan for that after period, because so much of it is going to be dependent on what you're doing before and during the crisis, frankly, you still want to think as you're planning about the fact that you're going to want to recover. And, success when it comes to cyber crises is getting back to business as quickly as possible. So from a reputational standpoint, you're trying to reduce the news cycles. You want to make sure that to the degree that you need to communicate with stakeholders, that you can do it, and then you can satisfy them, maintain their trust, and move on. And so I think that making sure that you are taking an approach in your preparation and response that are very focused to how quickly do we kind of get back to business and move ahead, I think is really important.
Mm-hmm. That's great. William, back to you.
Siobhan, another interesting question came up, which is maybe a little thorny, but need to ask it. Budgets. Have you seen increased scrutiny on communication budgets over the last couple of months due to COVID? And two, there was a second part to the question is, should it include or should it be part of the security budget? So who generally speaking covers the funding for these types of incidents? Where does the funding come from? And have you seen scrutiny or budgets cut over the last couple of months?
Those are great questions. So in terms of the budget, the preparation on kind of the communication side, best practice would be to integrate that into your broader communications effort, your broader cyber preparation effort. So it can come from the communications budget. It can come from the cybersecurity budget. It can come from like a broader risk management budget. And sometimes the board will tell a company to deal with it, and it just needs to come from somebody's budget. So, I think it's justifiable, if you will, from any number of places. One thing that I have seen in the COVID area, which is concerning to me, given kind of the uptick that we've now seen in breaches as everybody goes to remote work. And keep in mind, even as people look to go back to their offices, you're still going to have a pretty hybrid work environment, and for probably the foreseeable future. I mean, I would say at least a year or two, where you've got people working from home, certainly more often than they used to, coming in the office a little bit more, and that's actually a bigger headache for the IT folks, right? Because they've got to manage the on-premises situation as well as the remote situation. Unfortunately, the place where I've seen people kind of reprioritize, and this is understandable, right? I mean, you're dealing with a whole host of new crisis considerations around COVID, but they're cutting back on the cyber crisis prep, and that is in communications. That's also on the technical front. That comes when you're talking about simulations and things like that. And what I worry about with that is that because we are seeing a pretty sharp increase in actual attacks, that the lack of preparation is really going to be a problem, right? Because the whole reason why you prepare is so that you can respond more effectively, get back to business more effectively, and preserve, the trust of your stakeholders and your business, your reputation, all those kinds of things. And so for those who aren't preparing because they've had to cut back for budget reasons, and then they get hit with a cyber attack, which is increasingly probable now, it's just going to put them in a very bad situation. And I do hope that as companies start to look at kind of their next round of budgeting and are factoring in kind of how they're managing, in the COVID era or whatever the ongoing era is that we're in now, that they think about, cyber crisis prep as something that is going to be kind of a critical way to mitigate an important and growing business risk. And that, now more than ever, frankly, I think simulations are important for the reasons that I've discussed before. The fact that crisis response is just fundamentally different when everybody's remote, or if they're in some sort of hybrid remote, not remote situation.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And, I'm a great believer in simulation exercises, and I always believe they can add a lot of value to an organization. So maybe that's something that we can discuss on some of the future webinars. But another question that springs to my mind, listening to both of you speak, is around the cloud. So what I've seen at a lot of my clients over the last couple of months is a big uptick in migration to the cloud, or accelerated migration to the cloud. So as organizations move away from an on-prem environment to a cloud-based environment, is that creating more challenges for you? And do you think that the traditional communication crisis playbooks and processes and procedures contemplate a cloud-based environment, or will that need to be updated?
I guess there are ways that it might need to be updated. I'm not sure that from a communication standpoint it ends up having that much of an impact, because sort of the question of how your security is configured, or how somebody breaks into your system, matters a lot less when you're talking about the reputational implications as how you ultimately respond. So then you're looking at just broadly, what's the impact on your business? So if it affects your ability to respond, either in terms of the speed or the complexity or what have you, then that's a really important thing to take into consideration. And if simply there's just a change in how you respond, you need to make sure that people understand that internally and can prepare around it. So again, you can kind of reduce that response time and make sure that you can get back to business as quickly as possible. But in terms of how you communicate about it, usually you wouldn't be getting into that level of granularity. So that's more of a question, I think, on kind of the technical response side.
I'm sorry, I've got another question, but you're triggering all kinds of thoughts in my mind. But we talked about budgets and you talked about response time. What about metrics? How capable, maybe that's not the right word, but how focused is your industry on capturing metrics during a cyber crisis to be able to go back to the board or be able to go back to the business and say, hey, we moved the needle, we saved you time, we saved you money? Is that something that you think the industry's got a good grip on, or do you think that there's still work in progress? Because in my space, more in the technical space, the industry's dying and clamoring for more metrics, and quite frankly, we're still struggling to provide the business with the right metrics. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. So for incidents that get a lot of public attention, there are certain metrics, certainly around just volume of coverage, but then particularly around social media treatment. And in fact, our digital team has done some really interesting analyses of crises broadly and cyber crises specifically, where there's sort of a curve that you would expect to occur when you look at kind of social media activity. And so you can kind of plot where you are and against the normal curve, if you will. And if it roughly tracks the normal curve, then you know that you're kind of on the road to recovery. You can kind of gauge when roughly that's going to be. If all of a sudden you're spiking way early and it's kind of going over and it's plateauing, then you know that you have a problem and you really need to recalibrate. If it goes up and it goes right down, then maybe you sort of let well enough be alone. And so the social media area is actually where you probably have the most metrics in terms of quick feedback, right? Because you can almost track that in real time. In terms of broader media mentions, you can certainly look at that as well. But that may not always be something you can track quite as quickly, if that helps.
Yep, I got it. That makes a lot of sense. Well, listen, I'm conscious of time. We're just about a minute away from finalizing it today. So first of all, Siobhan, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your insight, your time, and your thinking. Hopefully you can join us at a future session, but thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Yeah, thank you. It was great. Thank you very much.
And David, thank you for helping out and co-hosting this today. I do want to point out that next Tuesday we have another session, and I hope you can join us. We'll be having Jeff Longhoffler, who's the CISO from Bank of New York Mellon, joining us. He'll be talking about stories from the front line. So please make sure that you've registered for that you've got that on your calendar next Tuesday at 12 o'clock. And in the meantime, keep the questions and comments coming. We look forward to hearing from you. We look forward to seeing you next Tuesday at the same time. And again, a big shout out and a big thank you to Beyond Trust and Recorded Future, our sponsors. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Looking forward to seeing you all. Thank you.